It began as an ordinary afternoon within the quiet corridors of a royal residence. King Charles, surrounded by the stillness of his private study, stumbled upon something he was never meant to see: a small bundle of letters bound with ribbon, carrying the faint scent of old paper and perfume. At first glance, they seemed harmless, but as he unfolded the first page, the words inside pierced deeper than any public scandal ever could. These were not political notes or family correspondence. They were love letters written by Camilla, his queen, to another man. What Charles read changed everything. The discovery that changed everything. The day had begun without ceremony. King Charles had retreated to his private study after a morning engagement, seeking the quiet he often craved between public appearances. The room was his refuge, a place where the ticking of the antique clock and the faint scent of polished wood gave him a sense of order and a life lived under constant scrutiny. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the spines of leather-bound books and the framed photographs that lined the desk. He had been searching for an old speech draft he thought might be useful for an upcoming address. His fingers traced along the edges of a drawer rarely opened, one that held personal keepsakes and documents from decades past. As he sifted through folders and notes, his hand brushed against something that did not belong. A small cream-colored bundle was tucked deep in the back, bound neatly with a faded ribbon. The paper inside looked slightly aged, edges curled just enough to betray that it had been handled more than once. At first he assumed it might be correspondence from his late mother, or perhaps something from his early days with Camilla, preserved for sentiment. He lifted it out carefully, feeling the delicate weight of the pages. There was a faint trace of perfume on them, subtle but unmistakable. He sat back in his chair, curiosity taking hold. The first envelope was addressed in a hand he knew well, Camilla's, but it was the name written below, not his own, that caused his breath to still. It was a name from outside the walls of the palace, one tied to vague memories of gossip he had dismissed years ago. His fingers hesitated over the flap, the choice between leaving the seal intact and opening it stretching into a moment that felt far longer than it was. When he finally slid the letter free, the paper was soft beneath his hands, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though pressed by hurried writing or perhaps tears. The opening line struck him harder than he had prepared for. It was tender, deeply personal, and without question directed to someone who was not him. For a few seconds he simply stared at the words, the meaning sinking in with a slow and deliberate weight around him. The room felt quieter, the ticking of the clock suddenly louder. He read on, each sentence layering a mix of disbelief, and dawning recognition. This was not a fleeting note or a casual exchange. It was a love letter written with intimacy and familiarity, carrying memories and promises that had no place in their marriage. Charles placed the letter on the desk, his hands resting beside it as if anchoring himself. The ribbon-bound bundle still held more, each envelope a door to a truth he had not been ready to face outside. The day went on as if nothing had changed inside the study. Everything had sealed in secrecy. For a long moment Charles did not move. His gaze lingered on the ribbon-bound bundle, as though it might explain itself if he stared hard enough. The first letter lay open on the desk, its words still echoing in his mind. He had read them twice, hoping that the meaning might shift with a second pass, that some hidden context might solve them of what they seemed to imply. But the words remained the same, clear in their intent, laced with an affection that was neither platonic nor distant. He reached for the second on below, the paper cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. It bore Camilla, his handwriting, the loops and flourishes instantly recognizable this time. And the date caught his eye. It was from a period when they had been attending a string of public events together, smiling for the cameras And speaking of shared commitment to their royal duties, yet this letter had been written in the quiet hours between engagements, sent to someone else entirely. Opening it felt like prying into a life he had not known existed yet. He could not stop himself. The letter was longer than the first, filled with small, intimate details that spoke of a closeness built over time. There were references to private jokes, moments they had apparently shared away from watchful eyes. There was a softness in the language, the kind that spoke of comfort and familiarity, not the guarded tone often found in royal correspondence. The bundle itself was carefully arranged. Each envelope was sealed with precision, the contents placed in order, as though meant to be found by the right person, but never by him. The ribbon was knotted just tightly enough to hold them together without creasing the paper, a gesture of care and preservation. It was this very care that unsettled him. These were not discarded scraps of the past. They had been hidden, deliberately preserved as something worth keeping. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of what he held pressing heavily on his thoughts. Who else knew of their existence? Had they been tucked away for years, or had they been read and cherished recently? The secrecy gnawed at him. In the world he inhabited, privacy was a rare and fragile thing, guarded fiercely against intrusion. Yet here was a part of his own life that had been kept from him, sealed away in the same home where he thought he knew every shadow. The temptation to read them all was immediate and strong, but so was the fear of what they might reveal. He slid the second letter back into its envelope and returned it to the bundle, his fingers lingering on the ribbon. The study, once his sanctuary, now felt like a room holding its breath. Somewhere in these pages lay the rest of a story he had not been told, and with each unopened on below, the truth waited, patient and unchanged. Outside the light shifted as the afternoon deepened, but inside time seemed to stand still. Words that cut deep. The decision to open the third letter was not made lightly. Charles sat for several minutes, his hand resting on the bundle, the faint smell of perfume still lingering from the paper. He told himself that knowing the truth was better than living in the dark, yet there was a part of him that dreaded the confirmation of his growing suspicions. When he finally untied the ribbon and slid the next envelope free, the knot felt looser, as though it had been undone and tied again many times before. The handwriting was unmistakable, but this letter was different from the others. The opening lines were more urgent, almost breathless, as if written in the middle of an emotion too strong to contain. There were no formalities, no guarded phrases, only a rush of words spilling onto the page. She wrote of missing him, of counting the days until they could meet again, of moments shared and hidden, places where no one could see. The imagery was vivid, painted with such familiarity that Charles could almost hear her voice speaking them aloud. Each sentence landed with the precision of a blade. There was mention of a trip she had taken, one that Charles remembered for its official engagements and carefully planned public appearances he hadn't heard telling. Those days were marked not by speeches or state dinners, but by stolen hours with another man. Details slipped into the paragraphs like threads in a tapestry, tying together frank months of memory that Charles now saw in a different light. Conversations he had once thought harmless now seemed tinged with subtext. Smiles he had overlooked returned to his mind with a sharp clarity. As he read on, he noticed how effortlessly she wove affection with secrecy. She referred to their meetings as though they existed in a world entirely separate from the one she shared with him. There was a warmth in her tone that he recognized, but it was not for him. It was the warmth she had once used with him long ago, before their lives had become an endless circuit of public duty and private negotiations. Now it belonged to someone else. By the time he reached the closing lines, Charles felt in a building in his chest. The words were tender, ending with a promise to write again soon, as though these letters were part of an ongoing dialogue. There was no guilt in them, no hesitation, only the easy confidence of a connection that had been nurtured over time. He folded the letter carefully, not because he wished to preserve it, but because handling it roughly felt beneath him. Placing it back on the desk, he stared at the stack of remaining envelopes. If the first 3 had carried such weight, what lay hidden in the rest? He imagined entire chapters of his marriage were written in these pages, moments he had lived now reframed with a truth he had never been invited to see. The letters were no longer just correspondence, they were a record of something that had unfolded in parallel to his life, untouched by his presence, yet existing alongside it. The study felt colder now, even the light from the window seemed harsher, illuminating the paper in a way that made the ink stand out against the cream cone pallid pages. He reached for the next envelope, knowing that whatever it contained would cut as deeply as the ones before. The truth was no longer hidden, it was here in his hands, and it was relentless. The lover revealed. The 4th letter began innocently enough. It opened with a light remark about the weather, a playful observation written in Camilla, mission written in. For a brief moment Charles wondered if perhaps this one would be different, if the content might be benign enough to dull the sting of the previous pages. But then, buried halfway down the first page, reference that shifted everything: a name. Not just a first name, but a full name, written clearly, almost proudly, as though there had never been any reason to hide it from the intended recipient. Charles froze. The name was one he knew, someone often seen on the edges of events, close enough to be familiar, but never eminent enough to draw public attention. He remembered him at receptions, always polite, always understated, the sort of figure easily dismissed as part of the wider social fabric. But here in Camilla, his handwriting, he was not a passing acquaintance. He was the center of her attention. As Charles read on, the connection became undeniable. There were references to specific places they had met, dates that aligned uncomfortably with moments when Charles himself had been elsewhere. They were inside jokes that made no sense to an outsider, affectionate nicknames that spoke of a history built over years. One passage described a meeting in such detail that Charles could picture it as though he had been standing in the room. The way she described the sound of his laugh, the particular shade of his jacket, the way he had looked at her, as though she was the only person in the world. These were not details shared between casual friends. The realization settled over Charles, slowly, heavy and unyielding. This was not a series of fleeting exchanges or a rekindled nostalgia from the past. This was an ongoing relationship, one that had carved its own space in the shadows of his marriage. The man's identity made it worse. It was someone within reach, someone he might have spoken to without suspicion, perhaps even confided in. The betrayal was layered now, carrying not only the wound of infidelity, but the sting of familiarity. His mind drifted back to moments when this man had been present. He remembered a garden party years ago, the man laughing with Camilla under the shade of an old oak tree. At the time Charles had thought nothing of it. They had known each other for decades after all. But now, with these otters in front of him, the memory shifted. He saw it differently, the ease between them, the spark in her eyes, the way she had leaned in slightly when he spoke. Charles placed the letter on the desk beside the others, his hands steady, but his breathing slower than before. The name on the page stared back at him, unmoving and undeniable. Whatever doubts might have lingered were gone. The letters were no longer vague or open to interpretation. The lover had a face, a voice, a history entwined with his own, and that truth was something he could not unlearn. Memories rewritten. The name from the letter seemed to echo in Charles's mind long after he had placed the page on the desk. It was as if the sound of it carried through the quiet of the study, attaching itself to memories he thought he understood. He sat back, eyes fixed on the window, but seeing only a reel of moments from years gone by. They came on, being sharp in detail yet now altered in meaning. He thought of a state banquet years earlier, when the man in question had been among the invited guests. Charles remembered greeting him warmly, exchanging polite words about the occasion. Camilla had been at Charles's side, smiling, and that familiar, easy way of hers he recalled. A way her eyes had flickered toward the man across the table so briefly, he had not noticed until now. In hindsight, at the time, it was nothing, the kind of fleeting glance people make during an evening of formalities. Now it felt like a thread in a much larger tapestry. One he had been blind to. The letters had turned innocuous moments into points of suspicion. A weekend in the countryside when Charles had been called away unexpectedly, leaving Camilla to host their guests alone. He remembered her mentioning later that the man had stayed for dinner, the tone casual, almost dismissive. He had not thought to question it. Another time during a charity gala he had seen them so, speaking quietly in a corner. But now he replayed the way they had leaned toward each other, the way her hand had brushed his arm as they laughed. These images felt different now, layered with the truth he wished he could unsee. Every marriage carries its share of unspoken compromises and moments of distance. Charles had long accepted that the pressures of public life left little room for constant closeness. He and Camilla had built their life around duty and shared understandings, sometimes moving in parallel rather than together. But this was not distance, this was an entirely separate connection, one that had lived alongside their life without his knowledge. He picked up another letter, his hands slower, this time almost reluctant. The words inside were warm, personal, and yet they seemed to bleed into his memories, coloring them in ways he had not consented to. References to private encounters were woven between reflections on public events they had both attended. There were mentions of moments when Charles had been present, but proof rural, his own presence seemingly insignificant in those recollections. It was not just what the letter said, but how easily they intertwined with the timeline of his own life, that unsettled him. The more he thought about it, the more he began to wonder how much of what he remembered was truth, and how much was a version shaped by omission. Had there been sign, as others had seen but chosen not to mention it? His aides noticed anything in the way they spoke or the frequency of their meetings? Or had everyone been just as unaware as he had been until now? A deep weariness settled over him, the kind that came not from physical exhaustion, but from the slow, heavy pull of betrayal. The study, once a sanctuary filled with the comfort of familiar objects, now felt like a place where his history was being rewritten before his eyes. Every photograph on the wall, every memento on the shelf seemed to belong to a story he no longer fully recognized. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. The stack of letters remained where he had left them, tied together again, but looser now, as if the bundle itself knew its secrets had begun to spill outside. The day moved on, the world continuing, and its rhythm inside the past was shifting beneath him, and the man who had walked into this room earlier would not be the same one who would eventually walk out behind palace doors. Word of the letters had not spread beyond the study, but the change in Charles, his demeanor, was impossible to hide from those closest to him. The king had always been a man of measured expression, his emotions rarely visible beyond the carefully curated warmth or solemnity expected of his role. Yet in the hours following his discovery there was a stillness to him that felt different. He spoke less, moved slower, and seemed to hold himself as though he were carrying something heavy but invisible. His private secretary, a man who had served him for years, noticed immediately there was no need to ask what was wrong. Palace life had taught him that some questions were better left unspoken, and until the king chose to speak first. Still, there were signs. Charles lingered in the study long after his usual schedule would have pulled him away. His tea sat untouched. Papers he was meant to review lay open, but unread when staff and they found him sitting at the desk. his gaze unfocused as if the room around him were only half real. In the quiet spaces between official duties, the palace seemed to absorb his mood. Footsteps in the corridors were softer, conversations among aides were hushed as though everyone instinctively knew the air had shifted. Even the usually bustling staff wing moved with a cautious rhythm, their curious city tempered by the understanding that whatever troubled him would not be discussed openly. By early evening, Charles had carried the bundle of letters from the study to his private quarters. The weight of them in his hand was disproportionate to their size. He set them down on a small table near the window where the last of the daylight caught the edges of the envelopes. It was a deliberate choice to keep them close, though he was unsure whether it was for the purpose of revisiting them or to ensure no one else found them. That night he dined alone. Camilla was elsewhere in the palace attending to a prior engagement, and he made no effort to join her afterward. Instead, he sat in a high back to here by the fire, the flames casting shifting line across the room. The letters remained within reach, their presence filling the silence like an uninvited guest. Every now and then his eyes drifted to them the way one might glance toward a door that had been left ajar beyond his private rooms. The machinery of the monarchy continued with a pause. Calls were made to ministers, invitations were reviewed, preparations for upcoming engagements were finalized. To the outside world, the king was fulfilling his duties as always, yet within the palace walls the gap between appearance and reality had never felt so wide. Those who knew him best could sense it. The measured politeness in his tone when he spoke, the way he avoided certain topics, the occasional pause before answering a question. In the stillness of the late evening, Charles walked back to the table and rested his hand on the bundle once more. The ribbon was loose now, the edges of the letters slightly uneven from where he had read and replaced them. He thought about locking them away, burying them where they could no longer reach him, yet he knew that even if the paper was hidden, the words were already carved into his memory. Some truths once uncovered could not be sent back into the shadows behind the polished doors of the palace. Far from the cameras and ceremony, the king was no longer Job, the monarch, fulfilling his role. He was a man confronting the quiet devastation of knowing that his most private trust had been broken, and that the walls meant to protect him had done nothing to keep this pain from finding its way inside. Confronting Camilla, the decision to speak to her did end